Okay, today we're going to discuss post-World War II America. So really, when you talk about post-World War II America, you really got to talk about 1946 through the 50s. So when we look at the 1940s, we're talking about an America that is coming out of the Great Depression, has just fought World War II, and defeated the Nazis, along with the help of the Russians and the English, the French, etc., the Allied forces. But basically, it left America in a very strong position, being one of the only global suppliers of products, which obviously leads to exorbitant wealth. In the late 40s, you had the baby boom. And the baby boom is referencing all of the children that are born 1946 through 1964. Those are officially the baby boomers. Another important aspect of post war America is the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine was a belief that if one country fell to communism, the next country would fall. Basically, a domino theory, knocking one country into the next, and you see this in Eastern Europe, as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, basically what becomes the Iron Curtain, and we'll talk about that later when we get into the 60s. A big part of the 1940s, and one of the main reasons why we as a country became so prosperous, was the Marshall Plan, the plan to rebuild Europe, which obviously we supplied a lot of the labor and the materials for. And you also had moving decolonization. The British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French Empire, a lot of the old world empires literally broke apart after World War II. This is why we get the creation of places like Palestine, and which later then become Israel. We get India and Pakistan, we get Vietnam, we get a lot of these countries that come up, and kind of sprout out of nothing, if you will, because of decolonization. This is also very destabilizing for the world, and this is what leads to things like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, yada, yada, yada. So you also have the first rumblings of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. This is what later becomes McCarthyism. Another big aspect of the late 40s was NATO. This is where we basically created a North Atlantic Treaty Organization in order to stave off the growth of communism. All right. So this was the East versus the West kind of thing. This is Jackie Robinson, who was the first African American Major League Baseball player, the man who integrated Major League sports, and this was also a huge aspect of the 1940s and 50s. People often think of the 60s as the big civil rights era, but the 1950s, that was the decade. The Red Scare was a large part of what we saw going on in the 1950s. And this starts with the Berlin Airlift in 1948. And this is really the Western world, Western Europe and America versus communism. The McCarthy trial begins. This is Joseph McCarthy. And this is, the communist under every bed Red Scare that goes on. Edward R. Murrow is a counter, and he was a journalist, but he is a counter to McCarthy, and he works as a voice of reason. This is also where the idea of complete and utter objectivity in the news media is kind of tossed out, or at least Murrow fights to toss this out, because as he argues, you cannot stay objective in the face of such un-American and unpatriotic aspects as hounding out neighbors and blacklisting actors and yada, yada, yada. The Korean War begins in 1950, and this is also part of that domino theory. Again, the idea that China will have massive influence, and if China can grow through Korea, then Japan will fall, and we'll be back at war with Japan, and we can't have that. Douglas MacArthur is a famous general from World War II, and he actually comes back into service to fight the Korean War. The Cuban Revolution happens during the 50s as well, so this is Castro and Che, and what a lot of people think about when they see The Godfather Part 2. There's also the Rosenberg trial, which are two Americans that are accused and convicted of spying for the Russians. So this adds again to the growing tension. And in 1954, American troops enter into a small Southeast Asian country that no one has heard about in order to stave off the Chinese Red Army. Again, 10 years later, we will be in a full war in this country. 20 years after this, we'll be pulling out of that country. We'll talk about that when we get to the 70s. Lastly, there's the two aspects that add to the Red Scare greatly are the Warsaw Pact, which is really kind of the counter to NATO, the creation of a military alliance amongst communist states in Eastern Europe, and the launching of the Sputnik satellite. You couple that with literally America growing to the point where we're right next door to Russia, with Alaska's statehood in 1959, and you can see how this sets up for some tension. This is Che and Castro planning the Cuban Revolution. This is Joseph McCarthy, the general that I mentioned from Korea, and finally Sputnik. You can't talk about the 1950s, though, without talking about rock and roll. All right. If you mix country western music with African rhythms and the blues, you get what comes to be rock and roll. But in the 1950s, the predominant form of popular music was this country and western music. It wasn't until 55 with Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock that a national rock hit happens. This is Bill Haley. Check out that hair, guys. Ooh. Buddy Holly is also a very popular singer in the 1950s, along with people like Jerry Lee Lewis, Fats Domino, Little Richard. Now, again, as I mentioned, rock and roll has its influence in country music, but it also has an influence on country music, with later singers like Cash and Nelson and Waylon Jennings and Merle Haggard. But as I mentioned, there's also the R&B roots of rock and roll. And if you've never heard of Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Big Boy Cudrup, or Bo Diddley, you need to Spotify those immediately. If you are a guitar player and you have never heard Sister Rosetta Tharpe, you need to stop this PowerPoint right now and go listen to her. Okay? And then we'll pick back up in the next slide. Consumer culture is also a huge part of the 1950s, okay? Being that we are producing more goods, we are employing more people, and the way in which, honestly, the economic structure is set up, it is designed that companies invest in their workers and invest in their companies rather than put money in their pockets. Productivity rises sharply after this time as well. Again, we had massive productivity during World War II, but after World War II, we get a huge explosion, both in the creation of houses, colleges, universities, but also markets. So you do get this consumption in the 50s, but you also get the creation of culture with things like the NEH and the NEA, the National Endowment of Humanities and the National Endowment of Arts, which are New Deal programs, you get the conscious creation of the American family. I will link you to some of these videos in YouTube so that you can learn how to be a good boy or a good girl or things like this. What is the American family? What is a good patriot? Things like this. This is just to show you how income and productivity rose after World War II. And then also you can kind of see in 1980 how it splits, and we'll talk about that later semester as well. TV became a huge part of the American landscape in the 1950s. At the beginning of the decade, the TV was a very, very expensive item, but by the end of the decade, a TV could be purchased relatively cheaply, much like you saw with VCR technology in the 90s, DVD technology in the 2000s, and so on. You also see a rise of, because of the Red Scare, you see a rise of kind of the Christianization and the religiousization of America. Communism is an a-religious political system. And so therefore, to counter that, people like Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, sought to make America a bastion of religion. At the beginning of his presidency, he didn't care which religion. By the end of his presidency, it was Christianity. This is Eisenhower with Reverend Billy Graham, who was one of the big reasons why religion became very popular in the 50s. He had a revival that lasted in Madison Square Garden for months. He literally filled Madison Square Garden every night for months. Okay. And in June 14th, on Flag Day 1954, we added the words "One Nation Under God" to our pledge. This used to be the way in which students would say the Pledge of Allegiance. They changed that in the 30s. And in 1956, we added "In God We Trust" on our money. You also had counterculture going on in the 50s with the beatniks, books like Catcher in the Rye, biker gangs, which are really disaffected World War II veterans who come home and decide that they don't want to be a part of culture. Beatniks, a large part of that as well. Again, just can't find a way to reassimilate, and they take that camaraderie and they create these fraternal organizations that become things like the Hells Angels. And this also becomes a very popular culture and style. Okay. Lastly, as I mentioned, the civil rights. Here's the big, dates of the time. 1954 and in 55, there were two separate rulings of Brown versus the Board of Education, which sought to upturn this idea of separate but equal. 1955 was the lynching of Emmett Till, and this act and the actions of Till's mother after the fact really solidified the civil rights movement. And by the time the Montgomery boycott rolls around, civil rights and the dehumanization of black people is at the forefront of the American media. Okay. In 1957, in Little Rock, when Orville Faubus refuses to allow the Little Rock Nine into school, Eisenhower, and uses the National Guard to do so. Eisenhower nationalizes the National Guard, orders the troops back to their barracks, and then orders the 101st Airborne, the guys who stormed Germany not a decade earlier. He had those guys protecting the students walking to class. This sent a clear message that civil rights was an American issue, and America was going to come out on the side of desegregation and integration. Eisenhower, for all of his faults, made sure that when the might of the American military was needed, he used it to bring about social justice. So all of this stuff kind of comes together to form what starts to become the America of the 20th century. We'll see this kind of countered against in the 1960s, tried to be rebuilt in the 1980s, and then again countered in the 1990s. So if this is your decade that you get assigned for your midterm, it's a very interesting culinary decade. You're going to find lots of new and exciting foods as soldiers came home from overseas and wanted to replicate some of those foods, like, I don't know, pizza, for instance. And Japanese food starts to grow in popularity. All of these things kind of come about in the 1950s. So if you have questions, feel free to post them. I will happily answer them and maybe even post more videos if needed. Thank you. One postscript. Wanted to include this image of Ruby Bridges that was painted by Norman Rockwell. It's entitled "The Problems We All Live With," and if you see here, you can kind of see Ruby, who is a real person, being escorted to school with some graffiti, tomatoes, and stuff being thrown at her. Norman Rockwell painted this in 1960 to bring light to civil rights. But I think it's important to note that this is Ruby today. This is not ancient history. This stuff, obviously, as we can see if you look around, is still happening. So be safe out there, and I will talk to you soon.